The truth is that the kind of state socialism that Marx is so often accused of is actually closer to the socialism of German politician Ferdinand Lassalle, who was, like Marx, one of the biggest names in the socialist politics of 19th century Germany. He believed that socialism was a matter of state control, and Marx heavily disagreed with him on this point.
Now, this idea that Marxist-Leninist states or other kinds of socialist states were Lassallean, or that they would have agreed with Lassalle, is a complete misrepresentation. Marx criticizes Lassalle for his utopian economic theories, but he also criticizes Lassalle for his so-called supernatural belief in the state. Now, the anarchistic-minded person hears that and thinks that that makes Marx an anarchist of some kind, but that's completely wrong. For example, Marx says about the Gotha program, quote, "But the whole program, for all its democratic clang, is tainted through and through by the Lassallean sect's servile belief in the state," unquote. And he says that because Lassalle is basically a big fan of a bourgeois state. Lassalle doesn't think that the state is an instrument of class struggle, which is completely anti-Marxist, and no Marxist state would ever agree with that. And Lassalle thinks that the state can equally, democratically represent everybody, including the capitalists and including the workers. So Lassalle is a believer in this type of class collaborationist state. And Lassalle also doesn't believe in any kind of withering away of the state. So it's a complete misrepresentation to say, oh well, Marx is this kinda quasi-anarchist who wants to abolish the state right away, while Lassalle still wanted to keep the state, and that's the only difference. That's a complete misrepresentation. Lassalle just had completely bourgeois, anti-Marxist views of the state, and Marx saw the state as an instrument of class struggle, which would eventually wither away in socialism and communism.
Just in case someone accuses me of providing an interpretation of Marx that is in fact an anarchist deviation and misinterpretation, Lenin agreed with all of what I just said. First of all, he agreed with Marx that in between capitalism and lower phase communism or socialism is a transitionary period.
The dictatorship of the proletariat has done all it could to abolish classes, but classes cannot be abolished in one stroke. Classes still remain and will remain in the era of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The dictatorship will become unnecessary when classes disappear.
Lenin here saying that socialism means the abolition of classes makes several things clear. First, that he distinguishes socialism from the transitionary period, or the dictatorship of the proletariat. After all, if dictatorship of the proletariat is rule by the working class, and socialism is the abolition of classes, they cannot possibly be identical. Secondly, that by implication, socialism is stateless. We can derive this through a bit of syllogistic reasoning. Proposition 1, according to Lenin, socialism is the abolition of classes. Proposition 2, Lenin accepts Marx's definition of the state, which sees it as an instrument of class rule, and therefore presupposes classes. Conclusion, if both Proposition 1 and Proposition 2 are true, then according to Lenin, socialism is stateless.
And that's really the problem. You can use syllogistic reasoning, and you can say, therefore, by implication, this is what Lenin supposedly means, but it's not actually what Lenin means. You're just making an inference based on faulty reasoning, because in State and Revolution, where Lenin describes this in the most detail, he says, quote, "In the first phase of communism, there still remains the need for a state. For the state to wither away completely, complete communism is necessary," unquote. Quote, "Until the higher phase of communism arrives, the socialists demand the strictest control by society and by the state over the measure of labor and the measure of consumption," unquote. So you can make all the syllogistic reasonings you want, but he clearly thinks that in the lower phase of communism, also known as socialism, the state obviously still exists. So this neatly brings us to the topic of national defense. So the basic question is, if the Soviet Union was socialist, how could it still have a state? Well, the obvious answer to the question is this. It was possible for them to build a socialist economic mode of production, but they had so many enemies, mainly outside the country, foreign invaders, imperialists, capitalist encirclement, that it was practically impossible to dismantle their military, to dismantle their intelligence services, etc. And of course, in socialism, you still need the state for various economic functions too, and it can only wither away in communism. So now that we're done with that, we have to examine the question, since Lenin said that socialism means the abolition of classes, and when classes are abolished, then the dictatorship of the proletariat can be abolished. In that context, he obviously didn't think that they would have foreign enemies. So he probably believed that the German Revolution would succeed, that the Finnish Revolution would succeed, that the Hungarian Revolution would succeed, and they wouldn't have to worry so much about all these enemies. But since all those other revolutions failed, except the Soviet one, this raises the question of socialism in one country. So, if the dictatorship of the proletariat succeeds only in one place, should they still go ahead and build socialism, or should they just abandon any ideas of socialism? Obviously, the ideal situation would have been if the dictatorship of the proletariat had succeeded everywhere and had globally overtaken capitalism. So the question was never about, should we only build socialism in one place, or should we build it in every place? No. The question was, since we only have a dictatorship of the proletariat in one place, should we still build socialism, or should we just surrender? That question began to arise in the 1920s, because by then the Finnish Revolution and the Hungarian Revolution had already been crushed, and it was becoming more clear that the German Revolution was gonna fail. So that's when Lenin definitively started to argue that, yes, they're still gonna build socialism, even if they have to do it alone. And there's nothing contradictory about that, because at the same time as you are trying to help the international communist movement and hoping that revolutions succeed elsewhere, you can also at the same time make progress in your own country. Because if you're not going forward, then you're going backward. So if they weren't building socialism in the Soviet Union, then that would have made the capitalists stronger. The state was forced to nationalize industries, not only because it's necessary for socialism, but also because that prevented capitalists from sabotaging the economy. It was necessary for the state to start taking over trade so that the merchants couldn't cause problems, and it was also necessary to collectivize agriculture and to move ahead in building socialism because it attacked the growing power of the private landowners who would have gotten stronger and caused more and more problems if nothing was done, and it also allowed them to industrialize the society, to modernize their military, and thus be able to effectively defend themselves from foreign attack. Lenin says, quote, "Socialism cannot achieve victory simultaneously in all countries. It will achieve victory first in one or several countries." Unquote. Quote, "When we are told that the victory of socialism is possible only on a world scale, we regard this merely as an attempt, a particularly hopeless attempt, on the part of the bourgeoisie and its voluntary and involuntary supporters to distort the irrefutable truth." Unquote. Quote, "Uneven economic and political development is an absolute law of capitalism. Hence, the victory of socialism is possible first in several or even in one capitalist country alone. After expropriating the capitalists and organizing their own socialist production, the victorious proletariat of that country will arise against the rest of the world, the capitalist world." Unquote.
Didn't Lenin consider the Soviet Republic to be socialist? And it couldn't have been socialist according to the preceding points because it still had money and the state. No, Lenin did not in fact consider the Soviet Republic to have established the socialist mode of production.
This is perfectly true. Soviet Russia was not yet socialist until socialism was built in the first two 5-year plans from 1928 to 1938. Lenin considered Soviet Russia to be semi-feudal and that in order to transition to socialism, they should utilize a type of state capitalism. This he called the New Economic Policy, or the NEP. And I have a full video on the NEP which I will link in the description, and I'm just gonna play a clip from that now. The NEP, or the New Economic Policy, was a transition policy from capitalism to socialism. When the NEP was implemented, the proletariat had conquered state power, and large industry was mostly nationalized into the hands of the state. However, it wasn't socialism yet, particularly because the agricultural sector was still mostly in private hands, hence why Lenin calls it state capitalism. It would have been inaccurate to call it socialism. It was the preparation for socialism. This is what Lenin said in 1923. Quote, "Infinitely stereotyped, for instance, is the argument they learned by rote during the development of West European social democracy, namely that we are not yet ripe for socialism. But as certain quote-unquote learned gentlemen among them put it, the objective economic premises for socialism do not exist in our country. The development of the productive forces of Russia has not yet attained the level that makes socialism possible." Quote-unquote. All the heroes of the Second International, including of course Sukhanov, beat the drums about this proposition. They keep harping on this incontrovertible proposition in 1,000 different keys, and think that it is decisive criterion of our revolution. You say that civilization is necessary for the building of socialism. Very good, but why could we not first create such prerequisites of civilization in our country, by the expulsion of the landowners and the Russian capitalists, and then start moving towards socialism? Where, in what books have you read that such variations of the customary historical sequence of events are impermissible or impossible?" Unquote. The Mensheviks and Lenin's right-wing opponents are saying Russia is too poor for socialism. Russia doesn't have the economic foundation or the economic prerequisites for socialism. So Lenin replies, alright, Russia doesn't have the economic foundations for socialism. So let's build those foundations and then we'll build socialism. Instead of just surrendering and saying, oh, okay, we don't have the economic foundations, let's just call it quits. We can't do this, we don't have the economic foundations, let's just not even try. No, he says, let's first build those foundations and then build socialism. Lenin also realized that in order to transition to socialism, it was necessary to create a collective agriculture sector, to abolish private farming. He said in 1923, talking about agricultural cooperatives, quote, "As a matter of fact, the political power of the Soviet over all large-scale means of production, the power in the state in the hands of the proletariat, the alliance of this proletariat with the many millions of small and very small peasants, the assured leadership of the peasantry by the proletariat, etc. Is this not all that is necessary in order from the cooperatives alone, which we formerly treated as huckstering and which, from a certain aspect, we have the right to treat as such now, under the new economic policy, is this not all that is necessary in order to build a complete socialist society? This is not yet the building of socialist society, but it is all that is necessary and sufficient for this building." Unquote. Quote, "Socialism is no longer a matter of the distant future. No matter how many difficulties it may entail, we shall all, not in one day, but in the course of several years, all of us together, fulfill it whatever happens, so that NEP Russia will become Socialist Russia." End of quote. Socialism is a mode of production. According to Lenin, in Soviet Russia there were at least 5 different modes of production existing side by side. He says, quote, "We find at least 5 different economic systems or structures which from the bottom to top are, first, the patriarchal economy, when the peasant farms produce only for their own needs, or are in a nomadic or semi-nomadic state, and we happen to have any number of these. Second, small commodity production, when goods are sold on the market. Third, capitalist production, the emergence of capitalists, small private capital. Fourth, state capitalism, and fifth, socialism. And if we do take a close look, we shall find all these relations in Russia's economic system even today. In no circumstances must we forget what we have occasion to see very often, namely the socialist attitude of workers at state factories, who collect fuel, raw materials and food, or try to arrange a proper distribution of manufactured goods among the peasants and to deliver them with their own transport facilities. That is socialism. But alongside is small enterprise, which very often exists independently of it. Why can it do so? Because large-scale industry is not back on its feet, and socialist factories are getting perhaps only 1/10 of what they should be getting. In consequence, small enterprise remains independent of the socialist factories. The incredible havoc, the shortage of fuel, raw materials, and transport facilities allow small enterprise to exist separately from socialism. I ask you, what is state capitalism in these circumstances? It is the amalgamation of small-scale production, unquote. Now what does all this mean? Lenin said that it was possible for socialism to be victorious even in one country, and he said that Soviet Russia has all that it takes to build socialism, and that for them, socialism is no longer a matter of the distant future. In fact, he thinks that they already have a socialist mode of production. It's just not the only mode of production. He says that the state-owned factories, where workers try to arrange things not based on profit, but for the greater good of society, that, for him, is already a socialist mode of production. But the reason Soviet Russia is not yet a socialist country is because there's so much private property around. The vast majority of farms are still privately owned, and there's even all these private enterprises, which, as he says, exist independently from the state sector, the socialist sector. So as a transition method, he proposes state capitalism. What does state capitalism mean for him? It means amalgamating these private enterprises to the state so that they don't exist independently from the state anymore, so that they function on the state's terms. The state sector for him is already socialist. The state capitalist sector is all these capitalist enterprises which simply rely on the state. So then in 1923, in his article on cooperation, he says that they have all that it takes to build socialism, and they just need cooperative agriculture, collectivized agriculture, as a way to transform the private farms into socialist farms, which is what they do between 1928 and 1938, when all industry is either nationalized or made into worker cooperatives, farms are nationalized or collectivized, and the regulated market that still existed is replaced by a full-on economic plan.
From the very beginning, Marx emphasized that the revolution would have to be international. Capitalism is an international system, and it must therefore be challenged on international terms. If a revolution happens in only one country, it will become isolated, and the only way for it to survive will be to make compromises and trade agreements with capitalist countries. And thus, in order to maintain itself, it will have to maintain commodity production, production for profit, never being able to transition out of capitalism.
So, trade agreements is capitalism. Well, I don't agree with that. I don't think Marx would agree with that either. Socialism is the common ownership of the means of productions, and a system where goods are produced according to need and not according to profit. Let's say that we don't have oil. Let's say we need oil, but we don't have it. Well, isn't it then in the interest of the socialist society to, let's say, make more bread and exchange it for oil? Maybe not ideal, but I think it's a little absurd to say that that makes them capitalists. Capitalism is not when you have a socialist society and they just have a trade agreement with another country. That is not what a capitalist society looks like. It would mean that in one segment of the economy, mainly the foreign trade sector, they have commodity production. But that doesn't mean that the society as a whole is governed by generalized commodity production, which is what happens in capitalism. Generalized commodity production means that the society as a whole functions predominantly based on profits. But obviously, if you have a socialist society, that's not true.
By 1921, most industrial workers had either left to fight in the Red Army or to return to the land. In the face of the situation, the Soviet Union became isolated and bureaucratized, faced with extremely difficult conditions through no fault of their own. Having lost their proletarian base, the party shifted from a revolutionary organization to the representatives of a capitalist society, functionally becoming social democrats, the state overseers of a market economy.
It seems that it's a common narrative for everything, that supposedly the number of proletarians declined so much that the party lost its proletarian base. So many people use that explanation for so many different things, but it's not as simple as that. Because when socialism was being built, the number of proletarians actually massively increased, according to R.W. Davies, from 3 million in 1928 to 6 million in 1932, and to around 8 million in 1937. So during the time that socialism is being built, the actual number of proletarians almost triples. That completely contradicts the narrative that, oh well, there were just so few workers that the party lost its proletarian base. In fact, in the late 20s, the party began taking measures to ensure that there's more workers. This is from a book by Molotov from 1929. So he says, quote, "Not later than at the end of 1930, at least one half of the party membership must consist of industrial workers, for which purpose at least 80% of the newly accepted members in the course of the next few years must be factory workers," unquote. And, quote, "The number of non-proletarian elements wishing to join the party within the next 2 years must be greatly restricted, in which connection office workers handing in applications must have several recommendations from factory workers or agricultural laborers in the rural areas," unquote. So they were saying that at least half the party has to be industrial workers, and if officials and office workers want to join the party, they must have several factory workers recommending them. And it actually worked. In 1930, the party had 65% industrial proletarians, 20% peasants, and around 15% officials. In 1932, the number of factory workers stayed pretty much the same, but the number of white-collar workers and officials fell to around 8%, and they were replaced by peasants. And this meant that the party was a lot less bureaucratic and a lot more proletarian than in the 1920s, because in 1924 there were only 44% industrial proletarians, 28% peasants, and as many as 27% officials. So it is a convenient narrative to say, oh well, there were so few workers, then the party lost their proletarian base, and then they became like these bureaucratic state capitalists. But then when you actually look at the facts, these supposed Stalinist bureaucrats are actually the ones who increased the number of workers, and even increased the number of workers in the party. And ironically enough, there were never as many proletarians in the party as in the Stalin era, because the percentage of workers was lower in the Lenin era, and after the Stalin era it also fell. The party had the smallest amount of officials and the largest amount of proletarians in the Stalin era when socialism was being built. Of course, the Soviet Union had a lot of difficulties because the revolutions in other countries failed, but it's a little weird to talk about isolation when socialism still eventually spread to so many other countries, so the Soviet Union wasn't isolated anymore. So, once again, if you just take that one little factoid in isolation, then okay, yeah, it's a convenient narrative, but if you actually compare it to the facts of history, the fact that socialism did spread to other countries, and it wasn't just isolated, then that narrative kind of falls apart.
Now, instead of focusing on support for revolutionary movements, the USSR increasingly moved to support for nationalist movements at the expense of revolutionaries.
Opponents of the Soviet Union claim that the Soviet Union abandoned the struggle for international socialism. They claim that because Lenin and later Stalin said that it was possible to build socialism in one country. But that doesn't actually contradict supporting the international working class and supporting socialist movements in other countries. And it's completely false to say that the Comintern supposedly didn't support socialist movements in other countries and only supported nationalist movements. That's completely ridiculous. The Comintern precisely supported communist movements in other countries. And, for example, the Finnish Communist Party at the time had most of its leadership in the Soviet Union, because communism was illegal in Finland. Most of the leadership was in the Soviet Union, some of the leadership was in Sweden, and some of them were in Finland trying to organize the actual struggle on the ground. Finnish communists were not only being trained by the Soviet Union, they were also funded by the Soviet Union. And the same is true for countless other communist parties. And I'm sure the opponents of the Soviet Union would then turn around and say, well, they were just Russian agents, man. They were just serving Russia, man. It's like, there's no winning with these people. If you support communists in other countries, then you're just a Russian imperialist. And if you don't support them, well, then you're just a Russian nationalist, I guess.
As one example of how bad this got, the Soviet-controlled Communist International, or Comintern for short, supported the Chinese Nationalist Party. Chinese communists in the 20s had attempted a revolution, but were stopped by the Comintern, and instead ordered to form an alliance with the Chinese Nationalist Party. And in 1927, the Chinese Nationalist Party massacred thousands of them.
We won't have time in this video to give a deep analysis of the Chinese Revolution, which lasted for decades, but here's the basic gist of it. In the 1920s, China was a semi-feudal, semi-colonial country which was undergoing a bourgeois revolution. The typical Marxist thing to do is to support these bourgeois democratic revolutions. That's nothing new. The two main progressive players in this was the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang or the Nationalist Party, led by a guy named Sun Yat-sen, who was a progressive, anti-imperialist. He was close to Lenin, and the communists formed a sort of alliance with the Kuomintang based on Sun Yat-sen's three people's principles, which were sovereignty, democracy, and people's livelihood. The Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party joined forces to attack the so-called Northern Warlords in the Northern Expedition. So they basically went around attacking these feudalist forces and landlords. The Communist Party at this point represented mainly the Proletariat, while the Kuomintang had a lot of peasant support. The Kuomintang also had an alliance with Soviet Russia, so at the time it made sense to support them. However, Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, and was replaced by Chiang Kai-shek. Now, this didn't mean that instantly everything had changed, and instantly the Kuomintang had become completely different, but during the Chiang Kai-shek administration, the Kuomintang quickly betrayed the revolution, and went to the side of the landlords and imperialists. It was more worried about the rise of communism than about imperialism or oppression by the landlords, etc. So it's a misrepresentation to say that alliance with the KMT was always wrong and the Comintern just forced everybody. No, that was the reasonable thing to do at the time, and it achieved a lot of good. It caused a massive rise in the communist movement. But the Comintern's huge mistake was that they didn't see the change in the Kuomintang until it was too late. This was also due to opportunism in the Chinese Communist Party itself, because the Chinese Communist Party was also caught by surprise. They also had a dogmatic attitude. They thought that they would carry out revolution in China the same way the Bolsheviks did it in Russia, so they would just take over the big cities, and that's that. Obviously that failed, and instead they began waging guerrilla warfare surrounding the cities from the countryside, and it allowed them to be victorious. This is what Mao says, quote, "Let us pay tribute to our great revolutionary forerunner, Dr. Sun Yat-sen. We pay tribute to him for the signal contribution he made in the period of the Revolution of 1911, when he led the people in overthrowing the monarchy and founding the Republic. We pay tribute to him for his signal contribution in developing the new Three People's Principles from the old Three People's Principles in the first period of cooperation between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party. He bequeathed to us much that is useful in the sphere of political thought. Save for a handful of reactionaries, the people of contemporary China are all successors in the revolutionary cause to which Dr. Sun Yat-sen dedicated himself." Unquote. So you can imagine that if the Kuomintang was one of the leading revolutionary forces in the 1910s and in the 1920s, it would be very surprising that they would betray the revolution in 1927, but still it happened. Quote, "For instance, consider the Kuomintang and the Communist Party. Take one aspect, the Kuomintang. In the period of the First United Front, the Kuomintang carried out Sun Yat-sen's three great policies of alliance with Russia, cooperation with the Communist Party, and assistance to the peasants and workers. Hence, it was revolutionary and vigorous. It was an alliance of various classes for the democratic revolution. After 1927, however, the Kuomintang changed into its opposite and became a reactionary bloc of the landlords and big bourgeoisie." Unquote. The Soviet Union did support also non-communists. So they supported anti-fascists, and they also supported anti-imperialists. The Soviet Union was heavily involved in the liberation of the colonies, in the anti-colonial struggle, in the anti-imperialist struggle. So that's why in China they supported the nationalists together with the communists. When the communists split with the nationalists, the Soviet Union also stopped supporting the nationalists, naturally. But the nationalists and communists were working together for a period to get rid of the feudal warlords and later to fight against Japanese imperialism. Personally, I don't understand how one can at the same time accuse the Soviet Union of nationalism and attack them for supporting anti-colonial struggles. First of all, what kind of nationalist supports anti-colonial struggles in the first place? And why is that wrong? It's not wrong, it's completely the right thing to do. we have to support anti-imperialism, and supporting the liberation of the colonies was absolutely the right thing to do. Now lastly, let's take a closer look at the Marxist theory of a socialist state. So in Anti-Dühring, Engels says, quote, "The proletariat seizes from state power and turns the means of production into state property to begin with, but thereby it abolishes itself as the proletariat, abolishes all class distinctions and class antagonisms, and abolishes also the state as state." Unquote. Now what does he mean by that? Well, he says that the proletariat takes over the state, takes over all the means of production, so in other words, builds socialism, abolishes antagonistic classes, capitalists, landlords, all those guys, and abolishes the state as state. Well, that's an interesting thing to say, right? Well, that's because for Marxists, the proletarian state is a new type of state. The proletarian state is the only kind of state that can't be abolished, and it's also the only kind of state that can wither away. He goes on, quote, "The first act by which the state really comes forward as the representative of the whole of society, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society, is also its last independent act as a state. State interference in social relations becomes, in one domain after another, superfluous, and then it dies down of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things, and by the conduct of processes of production. The state is not abolished, it withers away." Unquote. So when socialism is built, when the means of production have been taken into the hands of society as a whole, the state can begin to wither away. It has ceased to be a state in the old way, because the previous kinds of states can't wither away, they can only be abolished. But the proletarian state can wither away. Lenin says, quote, "In speaking of the state withering away, and the even more graphic and colorful dying down of itself, Engels refers clearly and definitely to the period after the state has taken possession of the means of production in the name of the whole of society." Unquote. Compare this to the famous passage in the Communist Manifesto where Marx and Engels say, quote, "The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degree, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, that is, of the proletariat organized as the ruling class." Unquote. There's some differences in nuances, but it's practically the same. So the idea that Marx and Engels completely changed their mind in the 1870s is not the case. It's false. However, they do say, quote, "No special stress is to be laid on the revolutionary measures proposed at the end of Section 2. That passage would in many respects be very differently worded today. This program has in some details been antiquated." Well, what does he talk about? What is the program? Well, it's the 10 planks, it's those 10 things, right? So they never said that the idea that the proletariat is going to take over the state and then centralize all the means of production in the hands of the state, that hasn't become outdated. It's just those 10 measures, those 10 planks, those have become outdated. And they continue, "One thing especially was proved by the Commune, viz., that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes." Unquote. So that was the real lesson of the Paris Commune, is that they can't just take over the bourgeois state and use that. They have to dismantle the bourgeois state and create their own proletarian state. So then, in the critique of the Gotha program, Marx says, quote, "The question then arises, what transformation will the state undergo in communist society? In other words, what social functions will remain in existence that there are analogous to present state functions? Now, the program does not deal with this, nor with the future state of communist society." Unquote. So he recognizes that there will be a state in the lower phase of communism, but since socialism had never been built in the time of Marx, he's hesitant to speculate about the details of exactly what that would look like. Lenin says, quote, "This is a defect, says Marx, but it is unavoidable in the first phase of communism. There still remains the need for a state, which, while safeguarding the common ownership of the means of production, would safeguard equality in labor and in the distribution of products. For the state to wither away completely, complete communism is necessary." Unquote. So Lenin, citing Marx, also talks about a state in the lower phase of communism, or in socialism, which would be used, to safeguard the common ownership of the means of production, and also to perform various economic functions. But he implies that in some ways it has already withered away a little bit, just not completely, because the withering can begin in socialism, but it will only be completed in the higher phase of communism. Just like Stalin says, quote, "The feature that distinguishes Soviet society today from any capitalist society is that it no longer contains antagonistic hostile classes, that the exploiting classes have been eliminated." Unquote. And he continues, quote, "The function of military suppression inside the country ceased, died away, for exploitation had been abolished, there were no more exploiters left, and so there was no one to suppress. In place of this function of suppression, the state acquired the function of protecting socialist property from thieves and pilferers of the people's property." Unquote. So just like Marx and Lenin say, the state is no longer used so much for internal suppression, but it's used for protecting common property and various functions of economic construction. As Stalin says, quote, "Now, the main task of our state inside the country is the work of peaceful economic organization and cultural education." Unquote. But he continues, quote, "The function of defending the country from foreign attack fully remained. Consequently, the Red Army and Navy also fully remained, as did the punitive organs and the intelligence service, which are indispensable for the detection and punishment of spies, assassins, and wreckers sent into our country by foreign espionage services. As for our army, punitive organs, and intelligence services, their edge is no longer turned to the inside of the country, but to the outside against external enemies." Unquote. So there's no contradiction here. It's completely consistent, and it makes sense. This wasn't just some crazy scheme that was concocted in the minds of lunatics. No, this was using Marxist theory and applying it to practical real-life problems.